expectations and clear scientific evidence and insights on the impacts that climate change is having on people, their lives and livelihoods from an equity and inequality perspective. We provide education on our unique Masters Climate Justice programme, and we are home to a growing cohort of doctoral students. Our climate is changing. Around the world, countries and communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change in different ways. Depending on socioeconomic circumstances, it is clear that some are better able to cope and adapt to changing circumstances than others, no matter where in the world they live. We recognise that the poorest and the most vulnerable suffer the most and thus face the biggest challenges. And this is where the issue of resilience comes in, and the context of this dialogue on financing a healthy and resilient climate future to tackle the burgeoning inequalities we are witnessing on the impacts of climate change. And now with the pandemic, inequalities are becoming more visible. There are three issues coming together. To achieve a 1.5 degree world and zero carbon emissions, we need to scale up actions that build resilience in a way that is fair and inclusive for the many, not just the few. And the only way to do that is by ensuring that health is recognised and firmly embedded as a game changer, as we were hearing this morning from Richard Smith. Healthy lives matter. We recognise the health benefits of clean air, of driving less, of a more balanced diet with more plant-based nutritional intake. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, national policies and market signals are starting to reflect on the urgency of increasing finance for mitigation of and adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and making all financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. However, the health benefits of cutting carbon emissions and NDCs is rarely reflected on, and despite the growing body of evidence which provides clear indication of the health co-benefits of reduced carbon emissions. So, to enable this to happen and to enable health to be embedded firmly, we need finance. Raising ambition, not just for NDC targets, but looking deeply into how the health benefits can be embedded into NDC plans and how this will require resources, energy, and participation of many stakeholders. To get us there, we need to have this collaboration and to work in partnerships. It was encouraging, though, to hear again this morning that change is on the way with the announcement of the NHS in the UK's commitment to reach net zero by 2040. There are no doubt many challenges that lie ahead, but I think also there are many opportunities and it gives us an opportunity to learn also from some of the significant changes that are taking place, particularly around the business sector. So this evening, we will be joined by a wonderful range of experts, and we've come together to host this interactive discussion to explore the changes needed for financial systems to drive a healthy recovery towards a climate safe and economically stable future. To try and bring this conversation to life, we will hear from perspectives from on the ground realities and for people who work across different sectors too. So without further ado, let's begin for our first speaker. I would like to introduce Mithika Mwenda, who is the Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Mithika was named among the 100 most influential people in the world on climate policy in 2019. His vision is to see accelerated implementation of the Paris Agreement to help millions of African people grossly affected by climate change rebuild their livelihoods through various initiatives catalyzed by the agreement. So, without further ado, Mithika, over to you. I think, do we have Mithika on the line? Are we? I think we may have a technical problem. Mithika, are you there? Are you able to join us? Mithika, could you unmute yourself? Maybe that's the issue. Mithika, could you possibly unmute? Apologies, we're just having some technical issues. Mithika, if you're there, could you please unmute your call? Apologies for this. Mithika, would you mind unmuting your call? Okay, so I think Mithika, we may have lost Mithika. I'm wondering, while we wait for Mithika to come back online, I would like to move on to our second speaker of the evening. We're going to be joined by Dr. Ania Essel. Ania is a dedicated medical doctor with a master's degree in public health. She has worked extensively in public health, also specialising in climate change and impacts on health issues at the national, regional, and international levels. She has been involved in the international climate negotiations, with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And since 2008, she's been serving as a member of the Ghanaian delegation and as one of the lead negotiators for the African group. So without further ado, hopefully we can get Ania Essel online to give us her perspectives. Ania, welcome.
Thank you and good evening, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Yes, so if we go on to the next slide, imagine the housewives who work in the indoor kitchen and the indoor air pollution and what they have to breathe in every day. Imagine in the next slide, the child who crosses the road, who has to inhale also the exhaust fume from cars. And as we can see again, the hawkers on the next slide, walking on the roadside, inhaling the same exhaust fumes. These hawkers work from morning till evening on the roads, inhaling. And even in the picture there, you can see also dark smoke as it comes from the markets behind Abu Bloshi, where goats and cows are burnt down and it's part of the delicacies of the country. So these things, as we see in the next slide, are part of the silent killers of air pollution. Air pollution is a silent killer that we cannot see, but it accounts for 7 million deaths a year. And it can be seen as strokes, heart disease, lung cancer, both chronic and acute respiratory diseases, including asthma. The impacts of air pollution is seen variably over different regions in the world, but it causes a whooping amount of almost 1 million deaths in Africa and even more in Southeast Africa and West Pacific region. And I think in every region, there's an accountable, a reasonable amount of deaths. The next slide shows us that health is important because as climate change continues, this will exacerbate the incidence of health outcomes from air pollution because climate change causes increases in heat, ozone, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter like PM2.5, PM10, sulfur dioxide, allergens. They all cause the diseases I've already mentioned. But the good news is that the Paris Agreement came up with goals that is encouraging all countries and all member parties to reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal. This comes with huge economic gains from the health sector. As energy scenarios project, when you want to mitigate the incidence of climate change, there are huge gains in the health sector. And this amount of the amount saved can actually help to run the mitigation agenda globally if the health sector can find a way to connect with the policymakers, with the people who sit at the financial discussions. In the next slide, we see that the current NDCs for pre-2020, for the red areas, they didn't include health at all. The blue areas have already included health. The gray areas did not even present any NDCs or are not part of the parties to the UNFCCC. This presents an opportunity for the health sector for advocacy. In the next slide, we see that the countries that actually presented the NDCs, some of them even portrayed health having core benefits for mitigation. And in the next slide, we also see the different arrays of health outcomes or impacts that the NDCs for pre-2020 have brought up. It's a long list, but still health has a myriad of impacts working through different sectors: water, agric, sanitation, energy, etc. Everything is interlinked with health, and health is a critical, pivotal, important agenda item for the climate change discourse. Looking at the next slide, you would agree with me that pre-2020 parties or countries had promised to have 100 billion finance available for mitigation and adaptation. This hasn't happened. What are the international negotiations discussing? The international negotiations are focused mainly on mitigation and adaptation, how countries can finance these. That is the main issue. When you sit in the financial negotiations, there's no window to talk about sector-specific finance needed. So this is an opportunity for the health community to think, how can we get a specific agenda item for health? For example, there's a specific agenda item for agriculture. Perhaps this is what we should be looking at, because in the financial discussion alone, there'll be no discussion on sector-specific needs. The health community can find the space and advocate for this to be essential. But even more important is the discussion that comes lower down the ladder at the regional and national community levels, where policymakers, politicians, and businessmen are discussing the finances needed for post-20 NDCs, for example, for climate change policies, and the financial agenda that goes with them. It is important that the health community rally around these things and make sure that we are a part of the voice, and we find a place where we speak through policymakers and health leaders to ensure that the health core benefits of mitigation is solidly integrated into financial discussions, and our importance is made known to all. I'd like to end with the fact that by saying that health is the most important pivotal thing in the climate change discourse, and the health community must not miss the opportunity to make ourselves relevant to policymakers, to aligning our financial requirements with the climate change discourse. I think I'll pause here for any further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amma, for talking us through some of the on the ground realities. I think we have some challenges with getting Mithika back online, but I'm wondering if I could just ask you a couple of questions with reference to the points that you were making there. And certainly the health co-benefits, and we recognise the benefits of that for our health and our lives and so on. But what do you think are the bottlenecks and the challenges, Amma? Why are these issues not discussed or taken forward on policy platforms? What are the sticking points as you see it?
I think at the international level, the way that the discussions go, for example, as I said, the finance people are speaking mitigation adaptation. They are not really looking at sectorial policies. So unless you have your own agenda item, for example, like we are speaking about health and we have a discussion and then we speak about the financial needs, then it goes back into the financial discussion as a placeholder. And when they are discussing mitigation, they would have to talk about mitigation co-benefits. And when they are discussing adaptation, they will have to discuss what you have brought from your health agenda. But in our countries and in our regions, I think the main issue is that the health community in some areas have not risen to understand the important role that the health community has to play in the climate change discourse. And it is important for us to come to the table. We have to find opportunities to be part of these discussions.
Thank you, Amma. And with just taking on board what you're saying with finding the opportunities, where do you see the advantage points? Where are the entry points to be able to start influencing their conversations? Is it at national level? Is it at country level? Is it regional level? Where do you think are the advantage points?
Ask me, the most important point is to start from your national level. If you let the national level see how relevant you are, when you find a way for the health sector to connect with the negotiators, to connect with the policymakers, those writing the national climate change policies, the NDCs, the national communications, when they see your relevance and you make them understand and they start integrating it into the policies, those policies are the ones they eventually take to look for finance. So then you're already in there because those policies will be developed into proposals that will be, for example, taken to the Green Climate Change Fund. So if you're able to put health agenda into a policy, a proposal, a national proposal, then of course, when it goes to the Green Climate Change Fund and money comes into the country, definitely, I mean, your proposal, your activities will be implemented. But then every level is important, but the critical level for me is the national, then of course the regional and international. But for the international, I think because of the way the whole discussion is going, I would recommend if the health community can find a way to have a health specific agenda item, I can assure you it will not be an easy task. It will be almost insurmountable, but the agricultural people managed to find a place and it took them years, but they finally have it. So it's worth fighting for.
Thank you, Amma, for that. If I could just remind the audience, if you would like to ask a question to our panel members, please do use the Q&A box and we will try and get round to answer as many questions as we can. Amma, I was just wondering if you could just stay on for a few minutes longer. And if you're able to take a question for me that's come in just now. It seems that part of the bottleneck is political. And 1 year the USA is out and, the USA will likely to be back in as a result of the new elections. But somehow we cannot make progress as political as governments swing kind of like backwards and forwards. So how do we address these issues? How do we, move forward with ensuring that health is front and center and trying and get sort of apolitical around the whole idea, just so that we're able to make a tangible difference to particularly NDC targets as we move forward?
So I think it's very critical that we work with the policymakers, as I said before, with the let the government start looking through the lens of the fact that health is critical and it must be taken seriously when when developing your NDCs, etc. So yes, it's very important that you talk about changes in political agenda, etc., which has really destabilize the climate change discussions at the international level. We are hoping that things get better with time. We are very hopeful now. But then, as I said, despite the challenges internationally, especially to come up with the finances needed for equity for all countries, those who have, those who do not have, developing LDCs, SIDS, Africa, to have access to the needed finance so that we all work together, leaving nobody behind. It is important that the bigger countries, the countries that should show the lead should have the political will to be able to find ways to bring the different avenues for financing, whether there'll be an international pot of money, insurance, business, private sector. We have to cooperate. And I think that in this discussion, the health issue is so important because we have something to bring to the table, the whole benefits of mitigation. And we have to come to the table ready to fill in the gaps that so far has held us back from reaching the financial agenda, because it is a big stalemate at the international discussions. And unless parties, the health sector can be advocates to stimulate politicians, policymakers, consumers, it will be very difficult for us to surpass the stalemate. Thank you.
Thank you, Amma, for that. And I'm just wondering, we have another question that relates to the conversation just now with reference to frameworks, or the lack of framework that currently exists to embrace the health issues and to embed them into NDCs. What kind of framework do you think needs to be developed so that we're able to move this from conversational and conceptual, which quite often these conversations are, to having a robust framework that people can relate to and refer to with indicators and really looking at tangible outputs? Where do we begin with the development of a framework?
I think that, if I may be wrong, but I think WHO has done some work along those lines. And maybe, yes, frameworks are needed to guide countries. And I think there are different frameworks that we can even get from some of the vulnerability assessment stuff, that work that WHO has done. And also just understanding, I think that the main challenge is also that the real health people who should be at the table are not there. So we have people like environment people trying to, I'm saying this as a case study from my own country, how I came to get so interested in climate change. And I'm sure I'm one of the very few doctors in Ghana who is into this. I think we need the right people at the table, because we have allowed other people to speak for us. So the right people at the table already understand the interlinkages with health and climate change if they bring themselves to the table. And together with the responsible body, that's the UN body for WHO and other important research organizations, I think that maybe a framework that helps all countries and all regions would be useful. And to start that, I think there should be a platform where multilateral, national, and bilateral discussions take place to develop a framework with indicators that helps us to monitor where we are in reaching the goal that we set for ourselves as the health sector.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amma. And certainly, it's the ideas of pulling together a framework is obviously critically important, so that we're able to use that framework as stepping stones and a guide to help us move along on this journey. Just one question, another question for you, Amma, just now, with reference to embedding health into NDCs. Do you think we should be thinking much broader rather than just NDC targets, and consider embedding health and turn it into embed it within national adaptation plans rather than just NDCs? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that honestly, and that's what we have done in our country, they are all very essential. So I think that every country should have a national health adaptation plan. And if I mean, in my country, for example, we have a national adaptation plan for all the sectors, and then we have an integrated one. So if the sector doesn't have, then it's very difficult to integrate it into the bigger one and into the bigger climate change policy. So what happened was that health sector in most countries lagged behind the national policies, climate change policies, when they were being developed, and the national adaptation plans, because for some reason we came a little late to the climate change discussions. But now we are very active, and I am very happy about that. It is important to have the sector adaptation plan, find a way to get it integrated into the national adaptation plan, and definitely into the NDC, because the NDC is going to be like, in quotes, the little guideline or the little Bible going for that most people will put their money in. They will support mitigation and adaptation in the NDC. So if you just put it in your own adaptation plan, you may lose having any financial support to your agenda.
Thank you, Amma, for that, for giving us a sense of clarity and some of the challenges, particularly with reference to accessing finance. I mean, it's absolutely critical that that these things are addressed holistically. So I want to just thank you, Amma, for your sterling effort in answering these questions. Thank you so much for doing that. And I think I just want to now introduce our next speaker of this evening. We'll be joined by Professor Jafry Sachs, who's going to take us into a slightly different direction now, looking at health and equity criteria in evaluating the investment value of companies and financial markets. Needless to say, Jafry Sachs, Professor Sachs, is chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. He's the director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He has been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretariats General and currently serves as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Jafry Sachs is amongst the top 3 most influential economists, and we are absolutely delighted to have him join us for this evening's discussion. So without any further ado, Jafry Sachs, is over to you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. And I hope I can add to the very rich discussion that has been underway all day. Let me start by saying that the health and the climate agendas are so closely aligned. In my opinion, there are not real trade-offs or contradictions. What we need for climate safety, first and foremost, is decarbonization of the energy system, and that's going to clean the air, of course, and it's going to save millions of lives from air pollution, as well as making the planet climate safe. We also need sustainable diets and sustainable land use as part of the climate solution. There's an excellent paper this week in Nature, I think, Nature or Science, on the importance of land use for achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, because the agriculture sector is such a large contributor of greenhouse gases that even solving the energy emissions is not sufficient. We have to solve the emissions from the ag sector. And that, fortunately, involves also moving to healthier plant-based diets, less beef consumption, less extensive pasture lands. You save land, you avoid deforestation, you have healthier diets. So again, no trade-offs, but important things to do. Similarly, in order to make our health systems work, we need to use digital technologies more effectively and have broader access, but that also it moves in the direction of a more sustainable energy system as well. So as a general matter, the direction of change, both for health and for environment, move in the same direction. And by making land use more sustainable, we will also reduce, though not eliminate, the frequency of zoonotic events like COVID-19 or MERS or SARS, which themselves are a reflection, of course, of the destabilization of the human interface with the animal disease reservoirs. Now, then comes the financing question. And there are so many aspects of the financing issues that need to be sorted out and made clear. First, there's the question of the trillions of dollars that will be needed for a clean energy system. The main point that I would make is we're going to spend trillions of dollars on energy in the next 30 years, period. The key point is not that it costs trillions for clean energy. The key point is we have to stop investing in the wrong kinds of energy. So we need to shift the outlays from coal, gas, oil to wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and so forth. That shift has to come mainly through regulation, not through ESG investing. We have to say no to more fossil fuel investments, the same way that we said no to the use of chlorofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol. We're getting close to saying no. More and more governments are clear about pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 and the regulatory environment that needs to underpin that. But the financing is there for power. It's just what kind of power? Is it gas-fired, which we don't need more of? Is it coal-fired, which is horrendous? Or is it investing in wind and solar and hydro and geothermal, which are the zero carbon energy sources that we need? So certain parts of this investment issue are not really an investment issue per se, but are a regulatory issue, which is stopping the continued spending on the wrong things. Similarly, we're going to have to regulate that vehicles after, say, 2030 have to be zero emission vehicles. We have to move to electric vehicles for light duty transport. That's going to happen, but it requires clarity of policies so that the manufacturers years in advance are already retooling for electric vehicle supply chains, for the scale up of battery production, for the retooling of the automotive industry itself. It's all feasible, but it requires the clarity of the European Green Deal or the other similar commitments that have been made by Japan and Korea and China, and what will be made by Biden very shortly. Now, there are areas that are really difficult for finance, and that involves the low-income countries, because they don't have within their national budgets the ability to provide basic public services, starting with healthcare, but also with infrastructure that will be needed for this transformation. That was true before COVID-19. That was even true purely on the basis of the access to modern energy services. So we have a challenge, which has been an age-old challenge, of providing sufficient, long-term, serious financing for basic public goods, health, education, water, sanitation, in low-income settings. That has not gone away. That cannot be solved by private market finance, because you can't run a health system or a school system on borrowing. That has to be on budgetary revenues. And this raises two related points. One is that developing countries need to mobilize more domestic resources through more tax collection, but that requires global cooperation because our global corporate tax system is a nightmare of evasion and avoidance by design of the rich countries. So we need to get serious to back up developing countries to collect more from the multinational companies operating in those countries. Second, we need more transfer payments to poor countries, which we would do if they were part of our national polities, but because it's international, the amount of development aid is just far, far too small. It runs at about 0.3% of the GDP of the rich countries, where they have promised now for 50 years to be at least 0.7%. So we're at less than half of the promise. The United States, one of the worst violators of the international norm of 0.7. Where is the wealth right now? The wealth is in the hands of really wealthy people. And I just want to end here that we need wealth taxation within our countries and globally, and we need taxation of the tech industry worldwide. If you look today, and I literally mean today, off of the Bloomberg website, the 500 richest people in the world today have a net worth of $7 trillion. 500 people, $7 trillion. Moreover, those 500 people have had a windfall this year in the COVID catastrophe. They've had a windfall of $1 trillion because this is the online big tech wealth. 4 people in the United States, Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, 4 people today have a net worth of $530 billion. So then we beg for $1 billion to save countless lives of poor people. We have to stop begging. We need to get serious in resource mobilization. And that means global tax reform. It means wealth taxation. It means calling on these gazillionaires who have $7 trillion to step up and contribute directly to these challenges. But our real financing challenge is poor people and low-income countries. And we need to get serious about this. For the rich countries, it's a regulatory challenge. It's a decision to stop the investments in fossil fuels and other polluting industries. And we are with a growing consensus on that, especially with the election of Joe Biden. Thank you very much.
Professor Sachs, Jeffrey, thank you so much for giving your personal and your considered insights into some of the biggest challenges that we're facing with reference to addressing health and inequalities and the differences that exist between the developed and the richest communities and the poorest communities. Can I just ask you a couple of questions with reference to that,
Sure.
Jeffrey? So the situation with the growing divide between the rich and poor, that's been going on for some time. It's decades old. What and as you said rightly, that 4 people have such a huge amounts of wealth. What in your mind do you think is the fundamental bottleneck that and the reason why things have not really changed, the landscape has not really changed with reference to the plight of the poorest nations, and now with inequalities in health over the last decades as you see it? And where do you see the scenario developing over the next decade? Or do you see it changing at all? Or do you see it not going anywhere?
It's a big question. You know, this election, the estimate now that just came out was that $14 billion were spent on the US election just now for advertising and other expenditures. Now, imagine where that 14 billion came from. It came mainly from rich people. So rich people gave money to politicians to run election campaigns. And guess who is going to be on the phone with the politicians now that they're in power to talk about tax cuts and tax privileges? The same rich people that made the campaign contributions. So we are in a plutocracy in the United States. We're in a government of wealth, by wealth, for wealth. And we've been that way since 1980, really, since Reagan won office, cut the taxes of the rich, and our Supreme Court, in its infinite unwisdom, unleashed wealth in our campaign finance. So I think we need to call this out very directly, that in a world where 500 people have $7 trillion and 4 billion people are struggling to make ends meet, and 2 billion people are struggling for survival, something's not right. We need actually to get serious about proper taxation and, by the way, proper philanthropy, because last time I checked, you don't need, if 500 people, by the way, each keep $1 billion, they would have 6.5 trillion of surplus. Last time I checked, you can get by with just $1 billion. I don't know about you, but I'm getting by with just $1 billion, you know? You don't need it. So what do they need 7 trillion for? And they should step up and say, we want to solve these problems. We have this unprecedented wealth and therefore ability to mobilize resources. Where are schools needed? Where are clinics needed? Where is the vaccine needed for delivery, and so on? So I expect many different approaches, but in a world of such vast inequality of wealth, it means we can afford to do better.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that. And I just wonder if I could squeeze in just one more question with reference to the inequality and the pandemic as you're seeing it. Do you think it's made any difference to the considered landscape, and with reference to how we embrace or address or tackle inequality, with particular reference to the emerging health inequalities that we're seeing across the world?
Well, the pandemic, of course, made the inequalities vastly worse. People, professionals, owners of the tech sector and so on, have flourished this year because people can work from home if they have a certain kind of occupations. The businesses like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and so forth have soared in value. And that means that the wealth of the professional class and the big tech sectors have absolutely skyrocketed, at the same time that frontline workers who work in shops or are first responders, our healthcare support, or people in the retail sector, or people in the tourist sector have seen incomes collapse during this period. So in this sense, the first reaction to COVID-19 has been probably an unprecedented increase of inequality in a short period of time in peacetime in history, would be my guess. Now, how we respond to that is a political question and a moral question, whether we can have an honest discussion about this or not. I saw one of our senators, Mitt Romney, give an absolutely obnoxious statement that now we have to, make sure that those progressives don't try to pull anything like Medicare for all, which in America is code that everybody should have health care. Which is, some outlandish idea according to Romney, or, a Green New Deal, which is the outlandish idea that we ought to move to climate safety, because these people are really conservative, but conservative for protecting the old interests, the old plutocracy and the old polluting industries. So this is an ongoing political battle, and it's a battle that is being waged worldwide. The heartening thing is we have clear goals. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the Paris Climate Agreement. We have a vastly better president-elect, so much better it's incomparable, because Trump was a true danger to the world. And Biden will be part of the solution for the world. But we need to raise our voice in a very practical way, saying, this is what's needed. We need X billion for this. We need to get the children in school. We need to be able to deliver vaccines. Africa needs another $30 billion for primary health systems. And here's the calculations. Now, President Biden, where is that going to come from? Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Bezos, what are you going to do about it? We have to ask these questions in a very direct way, because actually millions of lives depend on it.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that. For your and your very point there, millions of lives depend on the financing, and you couldn't have summarised it more clearly. And I'm sure we could spend many hours talking about some of the things that you've unpacked there, particularly with reference to political and moral responsibility. But for now, Jeffrey, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us.
A pleasure,
this evening.
Of course. Thank you for this important symposium. Happy to be part of it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So moving swiftly on, and to continue this trail of thought that's unpacking before us, I would like to welcome Dr. Barbara Buchner to explore rethinking health and equitable low carbon development and directing us towards business models that make sense. Barbara is the Global Managing Director and Executive Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. She's been named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change, and Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, and land use investments around the world. So Barbara, over to you, and we look forward to hearing your reflections and unpacking a little bit more of what we're seeing across the business sector and with reference to supporting a climate and healthy, resilient world. Thank you, Barbara.
Right. Thank you so much, Tahseen. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's been fantastic already to just like listen to the previous speakers. And again, Jafry Sachs, I think, is always very insightful, and I certainly am going to use some of the figures that he's shared with us today, which I think is something we all got to keep in our minds. But again, I'll come to this a little bit more from a climate angle, and I think we're all aware that climate change is happening in the here and in the now. I'm Austrian, but I live in North California, and we here have really been plagued with increasingly destructive wildfires recently. Just last month, people, including myself, we were not able to go outside for weeks to really avoid exposure to wildfire smoke, which is one of the most dangerous air pollutants to human health. And so I think that it shows you again this very strong nexus and interlinkage between the health and the climate crisis. But just looking a little bit more at where we are in terms of climate investments today, my organization CPI, we have been tracking climate investment since 2011. And the somewhat good news is that we are seeing steady increases and a surge in policy and commercial commitments in the years that followed the Paris Agreement, which this year will be 5 years ago. And that meant that climate finance flows crossed the $500 billion mark for the first time in 2017 and 2018. Annual flows rose to $579 billion on average over this 2-year period, which represented about 25% from the previous 2 years. But let me just again draw your attention to what we had from Jeff Sachs before. So we are seeing $579 billion per year for climate investments. 500 people at the moment have a net wealth of $7 trillion. There is certainly something we can do, we need to do in order to increase the attention of those who have the larger pools of money in order to really address the climate and health crisis. And in fact, while the upward trends that we have seen in climate finance are encouraging, we also know that we still fall far short of what is needed to achieve the global climate and sustainable development goals. So there's a huge gap that we can see between the roughly $500 billion in US dollars annual flows that we've been able to track and between the needs. And while we don't have any comprehensive economic numbers on the global needs, what we have seen is, for example, estimates from the IPCC that has identified a $1.6 to $3.8 trillion annual gap and need just for the supply side energy system alone. So we can see that there is a huge gap between what is flowing at the moment in terms of climate investment and between the needs. And I think, just linking it a little bit more to the situation we're in today, we all know that COVID has terribly claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but estimates from the experts around the world foresee that these numbers rise to the 100-fold over the next decade should we continue with the world that post-COVID really continues the business as usual pathways with emissions rising at their current levels. And so stemming the next crisis, this climate crisis, really means that mainstreaming climate action, climate considerations into regular decision-making is the need of the day. So we must continue climate action ambitious action, on climate change as the world recovers from the pandemic, particularly as trillions are being spent on economic stimulus. And what I see is that we really have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, for a more resilient, for a more sustainable, for a healthier future by targeting both the short-term economic recovery, but also the long-term economic structural changes that are in line with the sustainable, inclusive growth, and then also strengthening the society's resilience. And again, I think Jeff Sachs has already, alerted to a number of ways of how to do so. But I think I just want to end just like initial remarks by saying that not doing so really would not only pose a significant threat to a sustainable recovery, but it would also really pose a significant threat to the world as we know it because of the given climate and looming climate crisis. So maybe let me just stop here and pass back to you, and looking forward to discussing a little bit more on how we can get there.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for that, for giving us your considered reflections. As you see it, Barbara, what do you think, or could you share an example of what's of good business sense? Is there a good example out there that investors can follow and track and say, well, this is a good idea, and we would also like to follow suit in this track with embedding climate action into investment policies?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think the good news is that solutions already exist today to scale investments that can really foster a sustainable but also a healthy recovery. And maybe let me just share one or maybe two examples, depending on how much time we have. But I think one example of how to come up with these business solutions, with these solutions that really can help us kind of move the world in a better future are actually public-private initiatives, such as one that I'm going to briefly share a little bit more details on, one incubator accelerator, as we call it, which is called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which my organization CPI manages. And the lab is a public-private initiative of experts in sustainable development and in sustainable investments. And these experts come from governments, they come from development finance institutions, they come from investment banks, but also from institutional investors and other private sector institutions. And the lab's goal is to really unlock private investment in climate change and sustainable development at scale. How does it do that? Well, the way we're doing it with the lab is that we crowdsource new innovative financial solutions. We develop them and then ultimately help support pilots of these new solutions that really can tackle barriers and attract real investment. And since the lab started in 2014, we have developed and launched almost 50 financial instruments and business models that have together really mobilized more than $2.2 billion for concrete projects in emerging markets. And many of these instruments combine blended financing approaches. So there have public investors, they have impact investors, and institutional investors working together to overcome financing barriers. And again, one concrete solution that has come out from the lab, and which I think I can shed a little bit more light on how to get there on the ground, is an instrument that really tackles both health and climate change by investing in climate-friendly infrastructure projects that focus both on air pollution and on greenhouse gas emissions in cities. And the instruments I'm talking about is called the Breathe Better Bond Initiative, which is developed by the International Finance Corporation, IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank. And this is an innovative bond that's issued by local governments in developing countries, which is paired with technical assistance. So the proceeds of this bond are used to invest in projects that reduce both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so where are we with this specific instrument? The IFC aims to pilot the initiative in 1 to 3 developing country cities in the next 12 months, and thereby really reducing air pollution and addressing climate change. And in this way, having a combined approach to health and climate issues is a priority. Each of these initiatives is envisioned to feature a bond issuance between 50 to 500 million US dollars, and if implemented in 10 cities, which we hope will happen, then this initiative really could help mobilize an estimated $4 billion US in sustainable infrastructure investments that can both reduce the health impacts associated with air pollution, but also mitigate greenhouse gas emissions in these cities and in these countries. And so maybe let me just stop here. I have another example, if you have more time, which is more around extreme heat, which is, I think, another area that really needs to be addressed by looking at these joint benefits on climate and on health. But maybe let me just stop here for a sec.
Thank you, Barbara, for that. And it's really good to hear some positive stories of changes that are taking place across the business sector, and the idea of the incubator innovator. And I'm sure we could talk lots more about that, and particularly learn, if the key lessons that can be shared across different platforms and stakeholders. But for now, Barbara, I want to thank you for your contribution this evening, and I'm sure we'll get some more questions on that shortly. So closing the loop on finance and moving swiftly on, we're now going to be joined by Dr. Ania Grobicki to explain a little more on how the Green Climate Fund is integrating health into its programmes. Ania is Deputy Director of External Affairs at the Green Climate Fund. She has worked in academia prior to this and consulting on water, environment and development issues. For the last 10 years, though, she has focused on the links between water and climate, including water-related disasters, prior to joining the Green Climate Fund in 2019. So Ania, a very warm welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much, Tahseen, and hello, everyone. It's really an honor to join you in this discussion. So I'd like to really just follow on from the previous eminent speakers. As Jafry Sachs said, climate investments, and it's not a trade-off with health. And I think Barbara Buchner, who's just spoken, she also said that there are these joint benefits between investing in climate for health. So renewable energy, if we're investing in transport and e-mobility, that's an investment in better air quality. If we're investing in water access and water quality, wastewater treatment, closing the loop on water, that's improving people's health, not only through providing them with water to drink, also for hygiene purposes, for washing their hands during the pandemic, but also in terms of water quality, protecting people's health. If we invest in agriculture and food security, that's improving people's nutritional and health outcomes. So, and ecosystems as well, of course, we make, at the Green Climate Fund, we're investing a lot now in ecosystems and ecosystem services, the nature-based solutions. And so many of those solutions are, in fact, boosting people's health and well-being as well. So these are absolutely not trade-offs. I'd like to emphasize that the Green Climate Fund is the preeminent financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change. We were born in Copenhagen in 2009. By 2015, the Green Climate Fund made its first investment in a project. We were established here in South Korea in 2013. The board got going. By the time the first project approved, it was 2015, which was the year of the Paris Agreement. So our mandate is very much to help the Paris Agreement. Our goal is to finance both mitigation and adaptation equally. In fact, in grant equivalent terms, we're currently investing 55% of our investment in adaptation efforts and 45% in terms of mitigation. In nominal terms, it looks like we're investing more in mitigation because the financial instruments we use for investing in mitigation include concessional loans, they include guarantees, they include equity. And so if you then count, and more of the adaptation projects are 100% grant finance. So if you put it all on a level playing field and you calculate it in terms of grant equivalent terms, we're actually investing more in adaptation. So on this, in the first 5 years, from 2015 to December 2019, we invested a total of $5.6 billion in altogether. Our overall impact for that investment of $5.6 billion was 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent to be removed over the lifetime of the projects that were invested in, and 310 million people, beneficiaries, supported for health, water and food security, for more resilient cities and infrastructure, for agriculture, and land use and ecosystems. So we have beneficiaries calculated in all of these sectors. What we're planning to do in this current strategic period, despite COVID, and making sure that we invest and align with COVID recovery, we are planning to invest $10 billion over 4 years, which was the replenishment that happened last year. We're actually hoping that there may be more money now coming in with the more positive developments in the US, because of course the US did not contribute to the replenishment. So we'll see how that works out, but we have high hopes for that. But we currently have $10 billion for the next 4 years. We're projecting that to the end of 2023, that will fund the removal, well, the projects that we will invest in will remove a further 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, just to put that into context, 2019 emissions were a total of 37 billion tons worldwide. And so we are pledging that in our updated strategic plan to the end of 2023, we are projecting that our investments could remove 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent and support 610 million beneficiaries. So these figures are significant, but it's growing. It's recognize that this is a drop in the ocean still, and really what is needed is a redirection of global financial flows, as Jafry Sachs alluded to. But perhaps we could come back to that. So I just really wanted to emphasize that the Green Climate Fund is aiming to support the poorest and most vulnerable people and communities. We are here because of that. It's a mechanism to support the poorest and most vulnerable people. Our focus is on the least developed countries, on small island developing states and countries in Africa. And, you know, I think a lot of these investments, we've been talking in particular in the SIDS. I think it's been much easier to integrate health into the discussions on climate finance and climate projects. Perhaps because they're smaller and they see things in a more integrated way, also because their health systems are more directly impacted by climate disasters, by hurricanes and so on. So in the SIDS, we've succeeded in having regional dialogues on health and climate. In the Caribbean, in the Pacific, we're talking about green and resilient health systems and, you know, helping to protect hospitals and clinics from the impacts of extreme weather disasters like hurricanes, typhoons, renewable energy to remote rural clinics, for example, that is, you know, can help to chill the vaccines and so on. Providing renewable energy also provides huge benefits. We can talk about the detail of how one calculates the health co-benefits of a mitigation project, for example. But I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of the way the health community can really access climate finance in the way that that needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ania, for sharing the work and the direction and focus that the Green Climate Fund is taking, and also how, you know, your fund is setting up to support the poorest and the most vulnerable people, and particularly with reference to health. And it's nice to hear that you know, health sits firmly within you know, the frameworks that you have moving forward. I just have one question for you, Ania, before we move on to our Q&A that brings in our audience. What challenges do you think the Green Climate Fund had in trying to ensure that health is firmly embedded in frameworks with SIDS? If you could just highlight one challenge that you overcame that you can maybe share with us.
Okay, well, perhaps, you know, there's on a technical level, and then also simply in the way that the climate discussion has been framed. So on a technical level, we is security. Now, as Amma mentioned, the agriculture community got itself organized very early on in the climate negotiations, and spelt out, you know, the links between agriculture and climate very clearly. Currently, we now have the Coronavia dialogues that are looking at in detail at various specific areas of climate smart agriculture. In the water community, I was part of this with the Global Water Partnership. We used to say water is for adaptation as carbon is for mitigation. Water is a key to adaptation. It's the lifeblood of our planet. So we have now the water community got itself organized in the climate negotiations. There's a lot of discussion on climate and water. There's going to be a summit happening next week on climate and water. And so we have a lot of investments in the water sector, as well as in wastewater treatment, which is of course the other side of the coin, for people's health and well-being related to water. Health didn't, I think, perhaps organize early on in the same way. And also because it's framed more in terms of co-benefits, it's actually very important for the nationally determined authorities in each country to recognize that the health co-benefits of the climate investments need to be reflected. So I think in the SIDS, the NDAs, as we call them. It's in DCs, it's in the national adaptation plans. They have developed their health sector plans, but very few other countries have actually moved that far. And it's a matter, I think, of spelling out and recognizing for every investment in renewable energy, what is that going to mean in terms of health co-benefits to people? And you know, that can be calculated, it can be spelled out, but project developers don't always take the time to do that, and they don't always see the importance of doing it. It takes the health community to come along and say, so what value is this investment going to bring to people? And then it'll be reflected. Thank you.
Thank you, Ania, for that, and it really is enlightening to hear some of those issues, because that's the kind of like lessons that we hopefully take forward from these dialogues. So I want to thank you for your contribution there and to this discussion, and it's now over to you, to our audience. So I'm going to take some questions from our audience and see if we can get a bit more of a holistic conversation across these different presentations that we've heard this evening. I have a question here. How can we help developing countries consider climate change as an economic issue and not only an environmental issue? And I wonder if we can bring Amma back into the conversation. Amma, are you still with us? I'm hoping your connectivity hasn't left us. No, we might be having some connectivity issues. Okay, so I'm wondering, Barbara, can you help us unpack this question a little bit? How can we help developing countries consider climate change as not as an economic issue, not as an environmental issue? It's an interesting one.
It's a very good one, and I tell you, certainly something that has been, you know, making me kind of cautiously optimistic always, and then like in a sense of whether we will manage to meet the targets. Because I think what I've seen certainly in the work that I've been doing on climate change, climate action, climate investments, is that actually these are investments that make economic sense, they make business sense. It's very often that actually using renewable energy is actually cheaper and has like a more positive impact on a national level than importing energy, or like, you know, continuing to kind of use kind of the you know, fossil fuel energy. By now, I think what we've seen is really there has been so much innovation, so much decreases in the cost of technologies that are sustainable, you know, that are good for our climate, and they're good for our economy. So I think what we gotta show is really more at what are the specific, you know, opportunities that climate investments or climate action actually do bring. And I think, you know, we've done some studies, and again, together with other researchers across the world, that show that low carbon growth globally could deliver actually economic benefits of $26 trillion from now until 2030, and this is a conservative estimate. And just to give you a sense of that scale, 26 trillion, just the combined annual GDP of the US, Canada, Brazil, and India, at least pre-COVID. So it's really not kind of an add-on, it's not niche anymore. What we really see is that climate investments make economic sense today. They create the right jobs, they create the right employment, which is in particular important now in the recovery from the COVID pandemic. So I think what we gotta do is to really better highlight what are the overall implications of climate investments, what are, you know, the right investments to make, how can we actually show countries, particularly least developed countries, you know, on how to leapfrog some of the wrong decisions in some of the sectors that we've made over the last decade, and from which we are now basically still suffering in terms of the impact for our climate and for our sustainable development. So I think in a nutshell, it's really about highlighting and measuring, you know, providing specific examples, like really showing what are the overall comprehensive implications and benefits of specific investments, and helping in a way, countries to understand that actually, doing these investments that it can be good not only for your economy, but and for the people, but also for the planet on the whole. So I think it is about kind of breaking a little bit just also the overall understanding, breaking a little bit, just highlighting that actually climate is not niche anymore. It is supposed to be, this is like supposed to be mainstream, and we can see it also from the trends in investment, also from the private sector across the world, that these types of investments make economic sense today, and I think we got to just be much more vocal about that.
Thanks, Barbara. And I'm wondering if you could just take another question that's come in. Do you think that companies can still or can help us achieve a sustainable?
I've seen the effects of coal-fired.
Sorry, Ania, were you? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I was just going to make the point that where African governments are facing the choice between investing, for example, in coal-fired power stations for electrification or investing in renewable energy. Right now, the balance is tipping in terms of the flexibility and the cheap cost of renewables. The fact that with renewables, you can reach remote rural communities much more quickly. And so the development impact of investing in renewables, if you look at it holistically, and including the value of protecting people's health, it's now much outweighing the value of investing in old fossil fuel technologies. So I think if we start making these kinds of economic arguments, particularly for the electrification of Africa, it's going to make a huge difference when one looks at the holistic package you get with renewables and calculate in the health co-benefits. And that's a very important example, a very important direction to go in, and we need a lot more studies on that.
Thank you, Ania, for that. And I think, the being a bit visionary and thinking ahead as to where investment needs to lie over the next kind of decade is absolutely critical, and the direction into the renewables is absolutely vital for all the benefits thereof. We have another question here. Do you think that companies can still achieve sustainable development as long as they're still in the business of making profits? Ania, I wonder if I could start with you on that, and then head to Barbara. What are your thoughts and opinions on that?
The question in the chat, Tahseen, could you just reframe the question?
So the question has come in, do you think that companies can still achieve sustainable development as long as they are in the business of making money?
Oh, absolutely. And so what I was just saying about renewables, I think, is the best example of that. I think companies that are investing and putting their resources into developing solar projects, wind projects, are actually doing incredibly well in the current market. Let's take the example of solar-powered irrigation. Across Africa, solar-powered irrigation schemes are doing incredibly well. And from the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs that are moving into the solar space, because solar lends itself to small-scale projects and small-scale applications, right up to the larger ones. There are aggregators that are bringing solar irrigation companies together. That's an example of a booming area.
Barbara, I'm wondering if you could give us your reflections on that.
Absolutely, and I think Ania, we're very aligned. But I think we have the facts.
Barbara, would you like to respond?
Not only. I think you really have to facts. I mean, you've seen also there are studies, including from Bloomberg, again, that show that portfolios that are like aligned with ESG criteria, environmental, social, and economic, they have actually been outperforming the traditional fossil fuel investment. So this is not, again, this is what I meant before. This is not niche anymore. This is really today, it makes commercial sense to go into these areas. Yes, it's true, it still differs between sectors. So I think renewables, I think as Ania said, I think that the energy sector, we are more advanced there just because it started earlier. And I think the costs of technologies such as, you know, onshore and offshore wind and solar, that they have really come down a lot over the last few years. But I think there is like, this is what we need to do now also in other sectors. And we need to make sure that we continue to like, and I think the GCF actually is doing a very nice job here in like investing in the harder sectors, using public money more effectively to really make sure that the risks that the private sector is not yet ready to take on, maybe because, you know, private sector is not yet used to investing in sustainable agriculture. This is where we need to really come up with business models that can use public money most effectively to really unlock private investments and make sure that we come up with this blended finance kind of projects like the ones from the lab that I mentioned before, that really can show, you know, how the private sector actually, you know, can overcome some of the barriers, the risks they see, and really basically unlock private investment and scale. And I am firmly sure that this is something which is just going to go to other sectors as well. So yes, companies are, and companies certainly will more, you know, invest into the sustainable development areas, just because, you know, making money and investing in sustainable activities is not contradictory anymore. There is no necessarily, you know, trade-offs. Obviously, in certain sectors, we got to work more to come up with the right solutions. But in principle, this is really something which can benefit both. And again, there's a number of real examples, and I think this is probably something which has got to be better and coming up and showcasing actually, you know, where we have the examples. But you know, just I think back to your question, yes, and I think companies are actually stepping up in this context as well. So it's not only that something in theory, you can see also the overall, that the climate finance figures that I mentioned before, the dominant force behind the overall climate finance, global climate finance flows, is the private sector by the day, and that's been a trend over the last few years. And so I think we just got to make sure that that continues, and that we ultimately unlock some of the larger pools of capital that still are a little bit more on the margins. But yes.
Thank you, Barbara, for that. And I guess we've got time for just one last question, and it's to do with taxation. How do you see a taxation system being implemented, if at all, to a low-income country? We'll be hearing a lot about that. Jafry Sachs had mentioned to that, was referring to that. Ania, I wonder, can you give us your thoughts on that at all?
Well, I think there's been a lot of discussion and debate on the value of a carbon tax, as opposed to, for example, using carbon pricing mechanisms. And I think that going the taxation route could be a very valuable instrument. And this is one area where perhaps it could be really useful for the health community to get involved, and, for example, to advocate for a carbon tax could, you know, help to make more investments than in the health systems. You know, in a lot of places where a carbon tax is introduced, or for example, where governments try to put an extra tax on the use of gasoline, petrol, diesel, or they remove subsidies on fossil fuels like kerosene, it hits people where it hurts in their wallets, because they have to pay more for their day-to-day energy needs. And so often governments retreat from that. It's a very difficult thing to implement. But if it could be argued, and if people understand that, for example, the proceeds of a carbon tax would be reinvested in the health systems, so they will end up benefiting from it, you know, that could be a very valuable linkage to make, and a way to make that transition easier for governments to be able to implement those kinds of measures.
Thanks for that, Ania and Barbara. I think as I'm just looking at the time, I think we want to try and draw the conversation to a bit of a close, and it's just a few minutes left for me to reflect on this amazing discussion that we've had today. And as always, 90 minutes is just never enough to get through all the range of topics that we have and the challenges indeed that are before us. But just a few minutes just for me to reflect on some of the messages that we've heard this evening. From the outset, we were hearing from Amma and bringing on the ground realities and you know, the fact that people are really suffering the impacts of climate change and from a health perspective, and we can't undermine the significance of needing to embed health within climate conversations and climate actions, and the need to look at frameworks, something tangible that we can take forward and to move from this conceptual idea and recognizing the health co-benefits, but really let's make it happen. And we've been hearing about, you know, to be able to do that, we need the financial resources to get that done. And with Jafry Sachs talking about the need to stop spending in the wrong way, let's realign our financial flows with financial needs and indeed to get it done. But I'm also you know, heartened to hear about the investments that are taking place and the positive action that the business communities are driving forward. And it's an opportunity, as I see it, to be able to build on some of those examples of good practice and scale up and scale out and encourage other investors to follow suit and to enhance this conversation, because that's essentially what's needed. It doesn't need to rest in small pockets here and there, but we need more people to take action sooner rather than later. So scaling up and scaling out activity is absolutely vital as I see it. And as you said, Ania, you know, it's not just about the health co-benefits, but it's recognizing how vitally important it is to embrace those issues and take forward meaningful programs and projects that really embrace the value of tackling and addressing the health co-benefits, not just for now, but in the short term, but medium and the long term, because it's for our future generations to come. So I think that, you know, the conversation here this evening has unpacked so many things, and we still have so many things to discuss, and we don't have all the answers to all of the questions posed before us. But all I can say is that I really welcome everyone's contribution today to this conversation, and hopefully we'll keep this dialogue going as we move forward. So that, you know, it's just for me to say to keep joining and following the conversation that we've started to get this evening. The World Health Organization and all of our partners, we've come together to host these series of dialogues. Do follow us on social media also, and you can, you know, we're keeping these conversations alive. And it's just for me to say, in terms of a few announcements, the next session is on at 10 p.m. GMT, and that is a race for health, and the conversation, the dialogue that takes place after that is at 2 a.m. GMT, and that's on race for adaptation and resilience. So I think we've stuck to time, and a heartfelt thanks to all of our panel members today for joining us and for contributing to this rich discussion, but most of all, thanks to everyone who's listened in, our audience. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get through all the different questions as much as I would really love to, but wherever you've joined us from, I hope you have a very good evening or a morning, wherever you are, and do keep connected with us, and we'd love to hear from you again. So once again, thank you to everyone that's taken part, and to everyone behind the scenes for making it happen. Thank you.